is because very few people know about, let alone understand, what's happened to African people. Most people can say, yeah, I know there was slavery, yeah, I know something about the slave trade, but do you know something about the people themselves? Do you understand, even in the context of February being Black History Month, what does that mean? And how many of you have ever read a book written by Carter G. Woodson or Zora Neale or Frederick Douglass? I mean, have actually studied, like you do in your classes, when you have a syllabus, and you have books to read, and chapters and pages, and that there are lectures that go along with those books, and that there are additional readings that happen that you can go to the library and get, to actually have spent some time to study. One of the things that distinguishes those people who you hear speaking, for the most part, is they have actually studied. They've read books. When I was a freshman in college, we brought Dick Gregory in to speak during Black History Month, and he gave me a piece of advice that I followed at least for the next 8 years. He said, every morning read a newspaper and learn to do two things. Learn to read, and then learn how to read. And what he was challenging is, first of all, develop the habit of reading. And some of it is, most of you have grown up in a generation where reading has not been essential. That is because you've grown up in what can be euphemistically called the MTV generation. And that is, when I was your age, the only cable was HBO. In fact, I think there was 3 cable stations when I was a freshman in college: HBO, CNN, and ESPN. There was nothing else, and you could only get that if you paid a special licensing fee to get that. At that time, it was over satellite that was beamed locally. And probably, well, I could say even in the Twin Cities at that time, there was no cable in the household in the Twin Cities. And you only had a few people who had that. But since the 80s and throughout the 90s, more and more households have cable. That means in the households you're getting information that's coming over 50, 60, 70, 100, 200 different channels. And so you're used to things coming at you. You're used to things being given to you. And it's a challenge because it's a culture that those of you who are under the age of 21, 22 have grown up with. You've grown up with all kinds of information coming at you, but not necessarily with the skills or the habits to go and get it for yourself. You've grown up in a habit of being used to that information coming at you and using that as your basis of reality, as opposed to going and finding out. I've read books about the slave trade, and I've read articles about the Middle Passage, but it wasn't until I went to Ghana where it all of a sudden made sense to me, where I visited some slave castles, where I experienced places where African people were captured. And all of a sudden, it came to life. My exhortation, particularly for every African American, is to take some time to plan to go to West Africa. In fact, those of you who know West African students on your campuses, look at them and see if they don't look like African American people you know. And there's a reason for that, because there's a relationship that exists historically. Every West African I ever met reminded me of somebody I knew, some even my relatives, people I know who live in Detroit, Chicago, DC. And there's a reason for that, because in a distant past, not too distant past, there's a relationship, ethnic and a familial, that means family type of relationship. But again, you can't get that by waiting for it to come to you. You have to take up the cross to go get it. And I use the same thing. I use the same thing what a professor would tell you in class. If you haven't studied the text, you're not going to understand the lecture. I'm convinced that some of the things that Randall Robinson said today, and some of the things that Spike Moss said today, went by people. Because contextually, you have to have the same basis of information in order to relate to the entire context of what they were saying. And part of it is, these are people who've been well immersed in the experience of African people, who've always been involved. When I was your age, it was popular to be black. White folks wanted to be black. Today, I think because of Ricky Martin and Jennifer Lopez, Hispanic is in. You know, I don't know when, you know, Asian is going to be in, but in our society, in American society, there's, you know, there have been phases where it's cool to be ethnic. There was a point in time in this society where it was cool to be Italian. And at least every May 7th, I think it's May 14th or 17th, everybody wants to be Irish. So we go through phases in our society where there's popularity in ethnicity. And I think what's important is to look at the aspect of where we come from the standpoint of actually knowing it. Not just saying black people were brutalized, but can you document? Do you have dates and times and places? Have you seen pictures? Do you keep those? Anytime you get that information, you want to keep it. I've got a file this big, at least, full of information that I've collected over the years, from articles to handouts, to lectures, to classes that I've taken with the syllabuses and papers that I've written and the bibliography, all intact. Because it's important not to just make the statement, but to know what you're talking about. It's one of the things that I'm critical of in a portion of the hip-hop movement. There's a lot of people talking about a lot of things that don't know a lot about it. There's a lot of folks out there rapping about things that they don't understand. All they're rapping about is what they see. And anyone can do that. Anybody can take notes about what you see. But do you understand why it is that you're seeing it? Do you understand how come you're seeing it different than someone else is seeing it? And I think that's the distinction of being students. The distinction of being students is you're in a position where you can actually study. In fact, on these college campuses, as I love to say, there's more information in your libraries about you than you could ever study. And it's important to take advantage of that. In fact, one of the things that one of my mentors reminded me of, that on some college campuses, there are whole collections. For example, at the University of Minnesota, there's in the special books collection, it's called the Givens Collection. Mm-hmm. It was donated by a family from St. Paul, black family from St. Paul, out of an archive of a history of black people in Minnesota. And it includes books from all over the world. I heard somebody say last night, and I woke up last night, my TV was on. Everybody leave with the TV on? That's how important TV is. I fell out, and I woke up and I was watching Politically Incorrect. and they apparently were at Howard University. And the Howard University's president was on the little panel they had. And he made an interesting statement. He said, one of the things that's interesting about black people is they don't see themselves as black people in terms of the microcosm of America. Because in order for black people to have true identity, they have to see themselves in a global perspective. And when African Americans aren't looking at themselves globally, and they look at themselves under the microcosm of the United States of America, they will exist in a state of second-class citizenship. They will exist in a state of poverty. They will exist as being less than, until they broaden their perspective to a more global aspect. And the only reason, in fact, that black people have been able to manifest themselves beyond this thing in America that we call segregation and anti-intellectualism and everything else is because of the reality that most of that history has limited them to 300 years. And when you begin to study beyond that, you begin to see something. Let me give you a couple of books that I think each of you should have. Each of you should have in your libraries a book called The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. If you're an African American and you don't have this book, you are lacking something that is telling something about you that's historic. Every person should have that book in their library. In fact, our speaker tomorrow night, Dr. Naeem Akbar, has several books that you have to have. If you're serious about understanding who you are, one of those books is called Changing Images of Psychological Slavery by Naim Akbar. Again, he's our keynote speaker tomorrow night. That's a book you've got to have in your library. He talks about, in that book, the realities of how psychologically the system of slavery has set up African Americans to stay permanently in the underclass of this society. So many of the problems that are being complained about that affect African American people disproportionately, aside from the system of corrections, was set up to be effectual from the inside, from the point of view of slavery. And so that's a book that really talks about that. Changing Images of Psychological Slavery, Naim Akbar. And I'm sure he'll make reference to some of the things in that book when he speaks tomorrow night. He's written a whole bunch of books. In fact, here's a book that I think I'm going to be using, in fact, in the session we're doing on Saturday. It's called Visions for Black Men. Again, these books are essential. If you really want to know what you're talking about, but beyond that, the thing that these books offer is solutions. Because one of the things that I learned a long time ago is that if you talk about the problem, you're obligated to talk about the solution. In fact, Carter G. Woodson says that very eloquently when he talks about and defines education. Carter G. Woodson says in Miseducation of the Negro that real education means to inspire people to live more abundantly, to learn to begin with life as they find it and make it better. And it's the best definition of education I've ever heard. If it doesn't inspire you to live more abundantly, if it doesn't inspire you to look at life as you see it and make it better, you haven't been educated. You've been miseducated. Doesn't matter what your culture is. If you haven't been able to get that from your educational process, you've been miseducated. In fact, he goes on in that same paragraph to say, but so far, the education given to Negroes in colleges and universities has worked to the contrary. It's done no more than make malcontents out of those people who offer no program to change the undesirable conditions about which they complain. That's page 29. I memorized this years ago because it stuck with me when you see it. It stuck with you because it's true today. He wrote that in 1933. And it's still true today. That the educational process is set up in such a way to train you to participate in a society that systematically keeps people of African descent in second-class citizenship. It also helps you to understand what racism is really all about. Racism is not an individual thing. It's not a white person against a black person. It's a system against people of color. And it specifically and most damagingly affects African Americans. And there's a reason for that. Most Asians who are here in the United States, even those who are second, third generation, have a culture and language intact and a land intact. Most Hispanic Latino have a culture and language intact. It's there. You can point to a map and say Puerto Rico or Haiti or Cuba or Brazil or Nicaragua. You can say all of that. Even Native Americans can recognize that they used to exist in this land, even though it's been parceled out. Some of that is, even if you study, you recognize that outside of Europeans, no other group of people had a concept of land ownership, historically. Land was never owned. It was never to be owned. And it was a religious and a spiritual concept that most people outside of Europe had about land. So the Native Americans didn't own the land, they lived on it and existed with it. And so when they came and offered $1 million in the 18th century for this piece of land we call New York City, $1 million. They said, sure, because we don't own it. And so the concept of land ownership is basic in our society, is an entirely European concept. And so when you think about where people live, they lived where they lived, and they existed in that place of land that they lived on. But they understood themselves to be interactive with the land. And if you understand that, then it makes sense. It's also important to recognize, as I was saying, that you can be Ojibwe and Lakota and Cherokee and Shawnee and Iroquois and Illinois and Michigan. These are, most of the states are named after indigenous tribes, indigenous nations, and there's still culture intact in most places that can't be identified. In fact, the irony is most of us as African Americans have some native ethnicity in us. Just a part of our history of being here for at least 7, 8 generations. I say all this to say this. African American people struggle in a system that was set up to benefit primarily white men, even by legislation. One of the things that you should know, Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. If you don't know, any of you who's interested in public policy, in law, if you want to understand the legal dynamics of race, all you have to do is look at the United States Constitution, beginning with Article 1, Section 2, which basically says direct taxes and representatives shall be apportioned among the several states, taking the whole number of free persons, 3/5 of all other persons, in parentheses, slaves, excluding Indians not taxed. And basically that designated all non-white male landowners to less than human status. Think about this. The right to vote, the right to be represented, and the right to be taxed came at the designation that you're a whole human being. And at the beginning of the Constitution, if you didn't have the right to vote, which means you had to own land to be able to do that, which means you basically had to be a white male to do that, that the importance of being able to do that was based in the premise that now you can be represented in society. And without that, you don't have any representation. More importantly, you were designated to less than human status. In fact, right in that article, if you read it right, if you read it as it's written, Native Americans are a zero. They were considered a zero in our society. I want to implore you to go and look at that. Make a copy. Or you can go on the internet, pull up the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, copy it for yourself. Keep that in one of your files. In fact, something both Spike alluded to as well as Randall Robinson alluded to was something that's also written in the Constitution, but it's the 13th Amendment. How many of you know what the 13th Amendment says? What does the 13th Amendment say? Okay. See, understanding, here's what I'm pointing out to you. Understand that she knows what that says. The gist of it says, we're not going to have slavery. It's read this way. Slavery shall be abolished among the several states except for punishment of a crime. That means that slavery is legal if you're in the correction system. And historically, since the Civil War, in fact, between the Civil War and World War II, much of what was slavery was continued by prisoners. And historically, from that point on, disproportionately, to this day, in fact, continuing to be increased, there are more African Americans in prison than any place else. And they get parceled out to work for corporations. And I'm talking about back at the end of the 19th century. They were working for companies, free. They were basically being lent by the state to do work for private companies, and they raised capital. And there's many companies in this society. This is what reparations is all about. And you can't make an argument about reparations until you understand that history. I mean, you can hear people talk, but until you know it for yourself, if you've done some time to take just a few, you don't have to go through the gamut because it's almost exhaustible. It's inexhaustible. But you could just take a few examples of how whole industries in our society were built upon the backs of free labor. Whether that was during the 244 years of legalized slavery, or as Randall used the phrase de jure, which means by law, legalized segregation, or legalized slavery in the context of those who are in the prison system. Understanding that history helps you to understand the realities of where we're at today. And even in the state of Minnesota, they both pointed out the reality that the United States incarcerates more people than any place in the world. This is supposed to be the land of the free, and we have more people in prison. In fact, twice as much, 3 times as much as any other developed country, so to speak. And more than that, in fact, my statistics is closer to 1/3 of all prisoners in correction systems are here in the United States. All that to underscore this point. In the state of Minnesota, African Americans represent almost 3% of the state population. But African Americans represent close to 54% of the prison population in the state of Minnesota. It's the highest rate per capita of any place in the United States. Think about this. We incarcerate more people than anybody else. We have a huge disproportionate rate of African Americans in the correction system in the United States, and right here in Minnesota is the highest in the country. When I was in college, I took a course from a guy who was a psychologist in Minneapolis, and he had done some interesting studies, and he pointed out the reality, and then this was 1979 that he did this research. 44% of the prison population in Minnesota was African American male, black male. And at the same time, 61% of the black families in the Twin Cities were headed by single-parent females, single-parent mothers. So there was an interesting correlation between the numbers of African American men in prison and the numbers of African American men without fathers in the home, just in the Twin Cities, where the majority of African Americans lived in the state of Minnesota. You got to understand that history. You got to understand the problems that cause the things that you complain about. Even if you complain about on your schools and on your campuses issues of discrimination, you have to be able to substantiate that. You have to be able to say, here is the facts, and let the facts speak for themselves. You never have to make a defensible argument if your case is strong from the beginning. Otherwise, you'll catch yourself, like so many of us do from time to time, trying to defend what we say. When you put the facts out there, and this is what scholarship is all about. This is what makes you students. This is what you study this. Put it out there. Put it on the paper. The professor can't argue when you cite sources, when you do your footnotes, when you make your commentary. You can't argue with that because you've done your research. If you haven't done that, if you pick it apart. I'm not talking about grammatical stuff. I'm talking about information and data.
Is Chicago the only state to have hearings about reparations for slavery so far?
No. Chicago.
Well, not the state,
yeah.
the city.
There are a variety of places in the country that are talking about reparations. Again, this information is very well known. The state of Michigan, in fact, has a bill in the state legislature that would enable all African American families who have children in college to write off on their state taxes the amount that they pay for their children to go to college. That is written as a form of reparations under the understanding that this is a part of repairing. In fact, if you understand it correctly, even the issue of race, which is probably the most destructive thing that has ever happened to any society, because no other society has existed like that in the history of the world. No other society. The concept of race is a new one. It's as old as slavery, but not much older. As we know it today, the concept of race based on skin color, and then the attributes that are signified with that skin color. The attributes that say because of your skin color, you're dumb, you're lazy, you're shiftless. Because of your skin color, you're a better athlete. Because of your skin color, you'll be a better entertainer. Because of your skin color. All of these attributes that come because of your skin color, and no one has talked to you personally. I know a whole bunch of black people that can't sing. I know some brothers that can't play basketball, believe it or not. I know some black folks who can't keep rhythm. Believe it or not, they got brown skin. It's difficult for them. I'm serious. In fact, there was a guy sings in our church choir, struggles, trying to keep the beat. And for me, I can't not keep the beat. Even when I try, it's difficult for me not to keep a tempo. But he struggles with it. from Texas, too. But I say all that to say, and you have to know, you have to study. You have opportunities where you can do that, even in your classrooms, where you have options to write papers in various classes under certain subjects that you choose. In sociology classes, in English classes, in writing classes, in history classes, you have the opportunity to actually choose what you want to do for your paper. Choose an issue that relates to African people. Study it. And then, here's the challenge. Next year at the conference, come and present. Then you can know what you're talking about, and we'll all sit and listen and take notes.
And while you're doing that, once you start studying, you start learning things, because professors are not always right, teachers are not always right. They try to fake the truth of what's really going on. And once you start learning your history, and you need to call them out on it and challenge them to think about another view than their own view. Because if you let them continue to educate the way they're educating, a lot of people will continue to go through African American history, not even talk about African American people. And we'll talk about U.S. history instead. So once you challenge yourself to start studying, your culture and your people, you start to critically think outside your box, and you get involved in it, and it's exciting because it's something you need to know, and it makes you feel good that you're not lazy, you're not just, you're not all those stereotypes, but your people have done something, and there's a lot of history there.
How many of you have heard, there's a guy out of Berkeley that recently wrote some craziness, even though I believe in some of the privileges, the foundation is really crazy to me. How many of you have heard, as black students, that it wasn't cool? Like when I was a kid, I learned that getting good grades was acting white.
Yeah.
How many of you have heard something like that on those lines? How many of you get ostracized or put down or talked about when you're doing good in school, when you're studying, when you're actually turning in good grades and turning your papers in on time? The simple word for that, first of all, as a student, is responsibility. A better word for that is accountability, because particularly on college campuses like ours at Augsburg, you're paying $7,000 a semester. You should go to class. You're paying way too much money not to get this education, let alone doing the best that you can to make the most out of it. And then taking advantage of the opportunities you have to study something about what really is American history or world history, because in fact there wouldn't be none if there were no African people. When you think about it, there would be no United States of America if it wasn't for African people. There would be none. And that's real. But if you don't know that, if you haven't studied that, if you don't pay attention to that, you miss it. I remember Spike saying to me when I was a teenager, this was 22 years ago, and he shared a thought called the shook up generation. I remember almost this thing verbatim. And he said something that says, that speaks to me today. If you're not paying attention, you're going to get beat. And the reason you get beat is because you don't pay attention. Because there are people who are trying to encourage you, inform you, and motivate you to do the things that you should be doing already. And if you're not paying attention to that, you're going to miss it. People say that Michael Jordan is an anomaly. For a human being, he's an anomaly. Not just being black, he's unique, but as a human being, he's unique. I mean, the interesting thing to me is that in the past 20 to 30 years, all the black people that you have seen who have transcended blackness are athletes or entertainers. Muhammad Ali, Michael Jackson, if he's still black or white, I don't know. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods. In fact, it's interesting because Tiger Woods raises an interesting issue. Who am I? Is he Asian or is he African? And so it's an interesting question, because in our schools are people who want to check the box biracial. And I have yet to figure out what that means. Just because one of your parents is of European descent and one of your parents is of African descent, now you want to check the box biracial, but you haven't even identified what race means. In the words of my mentor, Mahmoud, who say, prove to me that I'm not white. Because I can do and say and think and talk just like all the white people I know. If you want to define it that way. You know, because it's not about a skin color. And when you get beyond that, then you get beyond this crazy notion called race. Let me give you another book. A Testament of Hope. It's all of the writings and speeches of Martin Luther King. And these are things I think you should have in your personal library, not just leave in your school libraries, but things that you should spend some money as opposed to buying that McDonald's or that Wendy's, or buying that new blouse, or them extra pair of school clothes, the gear that you want for the fall. Spend some money and do something that's going to last, because what you buy is going to wear out. What you eat is going to run through you. But what you take into your mind and your soul will stick with you the rest of your life. If you want to talk from a sense of knowledge, from a sense of confidence, you have to have studied. The only reason, in fact, I read an article about 2 weeks ago after the NBA All-Star game where a guy was commenting that the All-Star game was made up of all black NBA players. And he was talking about how we're going to affirmative action this, how we're going to get some white guys in the NBA All-Star game. Bloody Divac was added as a footnote because Shaq couldn't play. So the reality was you had this all-black NBA All-Star game. Well, how many of the coaches are black? How many of the owners are black? Because when you talk about, they talked about for too long how much money Kevin Garnett was paid 3 years ago when he signed the $129 million contract. But the guy who lives in this city had the money to pay him.
Right.
He couldn't have wrote him a check for $129 million if he didn't have it. Which means he has even that much more, because he's obviously making that much off of him in order to pay him that. Now the Bible says a laborer is worthy of his hire. But it also means that you're getting something for your labor. And most of you, when you graduate from college, if you decide to work for a corporation, which some of us call neo-plantations, you'll get into a situation where you're actually making 3 times for that company what you're being paid. If they pay you $55,000 a year salary, be sure that they're making $200,000 off of you. That's real. That's business. I'm not going to pay you and not pay me if this is my business. And when you look at that reality, the only reason that, how many of you know why blacks dominate the NBA? Somebody here knows why blacks dominate the NBA. Because that's what these brothers do more. If you spend time on the court from 3, 4, and 5 years old, shooting, dribbling, dunking, a basketball, and you do that 3, 4 hours a day for 15 years, what do you think you're going to be good at? Mm-hmm. But if you spend 3 or 4 hours a day studying mathematics, computer science, history, literature, sociology, that's what you're going to be good at. Black people aren't better entertainers or athletes because that's in their genes. It's because that's what we've been programmed in this society to do more of. And indeed, in the past 30 years, for those who made it, that wasn't out. Even for those who just made it to college, who understood that. I made it to college on a football scholarship, even though football was something you weren't going to play. I made it to college on a basketball scholarship, even though you never played a day in the NBA. You took advantage of the system that gave you an out. But if your only thought is to end up in the NBA and you're one of the 100,000 college basketball players that doesn't make it into the NBA every year, you should at least have a degree.
No, you had mentioned earlier about racism, and I was just thinking for the group, if you could provide some clarification in terms of the difference between racism, discrimination, and prejudice, because I think sometimes students are not, I mean, an example of a system.
Yeah. Racism, first of all, is based on the false notion of race. That is, if you believe in the concept of race, then you can understand its foundation. Racism exists systemically as a result of what some call the fear of white genetic annihilation. Here's where racism comes from. European sailors began to traverse the world, and as they were going to and fro, everywhere they were going, there were people of color. And these sailors, with their natural biological instincts, was getting with the women, producing children who looked more like their mothers than they did them. Psychologically, what began to build up is if we keep doing this, there'll be no more people that look like me. As a result of that, and in addition to other factors that added to slavery, the whole notion of racism was created as we understand it today. It was set up systemically to keep a white supremacist notion in power. That is, if I'm white and I'm male, I have to maintain the power. I mean, they're a minority in our society. They're a minority in our world, yet they maintain power and control over everything. And I learned this out of the whole same context when I used to counsel with men who had battered their girlfriends and their wives. I used to do counseling for men who were abused, and most of these men were court ordered to attend these 16-week classes we used to do. And I learned something that was intriguing to me. Once you've taken somebody and reduced them to the level of subhuman, then you can do anything you want to. You can crush them, beat them, kick them, but this is just an object. This is not a human being. In fact, I can crush it and throw it away. I was good at basketball. I was good. Without thinking about it. You can damage them. You can beat them down and feel like there's nothing wrong with that. That same premise is the underpinning of what racism is. Historically, in our society, not only have white folks felt not just obliged, but like it was cool to make sure to keep the niggas in their place. What's worse than that is a number of those black folks felt that that's what they deserved. It's conditioning. And racism is the force that keeps that conditioning in place. Racism is the force systemically that keeps black people from thinking that they can learn, and if they do learn, telling them that they're really not black. If they do get an A on that paper, if they do score well on that final, on that test, then there's something wrong with it. They're not down. They're no longer cool. They're no longer with it. Racism is a systemic force. And you have to have social, political, economic power in order to be racist, which basically, by definition, in our society means the only people who can be racist. See, let me change this around. Do you think black people can? How many people think black people can be racist? She thinks black people. You think black people can be racist? How?
If they have the power and the money and they think that they're not black, then they can be racist against them.
If they have the power and the money and they think they're not black, who can they be racist against?
Other races of people. And even blacks themselves too.
So you say black people can be racist to black people? What you say?
I've heard other cultures talk about other cultures in racist manners. They're better than them for this reason, or
Okay, let me give you, and I think it will be important for you to understand this. Racism has to go along with the power to do it. Otherwise, it's just prejudice or discrimination. The understanding of simple bias is that everybody is biased. You know, I read something that was ridiculous. At San Diego State University has a hate crimes policy. And most campuses have some semblance of hate crimes policy. Hate crimes policy came into being for two reasons. Because blacks were getting beaten, and because homosexuals were being beaten. That's why hate crimes policy was put into effect in schools and campuses around the country. Because of those two groups were being specifically targeted out. Now, at San Diego State University, I read their hate crimes policy. If I call you a name because you're fat or you're skinny, that's a hate crime. So what it literally did was dilute the entire premise of what hate crimes is supposed to be about. So now it carries no weight to change the condition about what it was trying to do in the first place. Understand this, black people can be racist towards other black people when they participate in the system that's set up to destroy black people. In other words, just because I become the CEO of a corporation, or I become mayor of the city, or governor of the state, or senator to the United States Congress, doesn't mean that I can't, now I'm in a position to change something. Now I'm in a position to do something. This is what happened in the 70s. Between 1969 and 1979, there was a huge increase in blacks in the political system. To that point, maybe in about to the mid-60s, maybe in about 6 or 7 cities, there were black mayors. By 1979, there were 150 cities with black mayors. And I'm not just talking about major ones, I'm talking about small cities. And the reason this is important to point out is because even with those forces in place, even with people who have made it in the upper echelons of corporate structure, the system didn't change. So in other words, what was happening was, and this is what our educational system is designed to do, it's designed to make you a participant in the system. And if you're not conscious, you do it all the time, without knowing it. Let me tell you how black people can be racist towards black people. I hear it in the hip-hop music, when brothers is referring to women as bitches and hoes. Because what now I'm doing is what had historically been done by white people towards black women, historically, and been given substance or given foundation, given authority by the government. In other words, even when you talk about reparations, I'm not going to go up to her or her to ask her for my money any more than I'm going to ask you, because they don't owe me any more than you owe me. But the United States government does owe. And when you look at all the little things that go along with the effects of slavery, I mean, that's a couple years ago, something happened here at this conference that blew my mind. We were in, you might have been here. We were in a session. It was heated at first, black male-female relationships. It was heated at first. And then it came some bonding, and we worked on some stuff. Brothers was going to be polite. Got to the party that night. The first song I hear was, "There's some hoes in this house, there's some hoes in this house." Remember that song? I know y'all remember that song. And the trip about that was there was about 15 sisters, several of whom were fussing in this male-female relationship workshop about brothers not treating them or not respecting them, out on the floor dancing to this music. And that's all the song said. I don't even know there's any other words to that song. This is what happens to a mind that's been perverted and distorted by a racist system to the point where you're unconscious of what you do to yourself to destroy yourself. Black on black crime? All of these things can be traced back to slavery. Racial profiling? Racial profiling is that old. Because in slave times, it was the overseer who was beating us down, beating us with the whip, keeping us in check. Because he had the legal authority to do so, just like the police do. One of the things that may be important for you to know as white students is that in general, blacks from the urban and rural South grow up with an inherent fear towards law enforcement. Where where the white community generally looks at law enforcement as peace officers, officers of the peace. Black folks generally look at that as somebody who's coming to beat them down, no matter what they're doing. And so inherent, and that's been there for generations. Again, that goes all the way back to slavery because the system has not changed and the actions have not changed. And that's the important thing we want to understand the history of racism. The actions that were similar when slaves were beaten and whipped and maimed, or when during segregation, particularly in the South, when a brother got out of line, when he looked the wrong way at a white woman. See, there was a time when if I looked at you like this, they could take me out. And it wasn't too long ago. It was in my lifetime. I'm only 38 years old. It wasn't that long ago. And I say that because most of you have grown up without hearing, seeing, or understanding what those images are. But the reality is they're right there in your libraries. In fact, some of them are actually in the classes that you've taken. But oftentimes the information gets overlooked, it gets glossed over. When the reality is that it impacted society in such a way where you can even be ignorant of it today. And they say that the people who forget their past, are doomed to repeat it. The warning Spike Moss was given, and he shared it with me before he started speaking. It was an interesting thought. Because legally, most of the gains of the 60s are in danger. And at some point in time, unless something changes, I'm talking about something that will be drastic, unless something drastic changes, and I don't say this to hype anybody, but our society is on the road to true race riots. Our society is on the pathway to true disintegration, to true breakdown, socially, morally, politically, and economically. How many have ever studied Marx? Yeah. Marx's biggest problem was something that he's most famous for saying. Marx said religion is the opiate of the people. That's why communism doesn't work. That's why it didn't work. Because it's devoid of faith. It's devoid of God. Socialism works when it's based in faith. I argue with any one of my conservative white Christians and black Christians when they talk about the context of the economics of this country and capitalism, that Christianity is fundamentally socialistic. You can't be a Christian and not be socialistic. Fundamentally, as an ideology, Christianity is socialism. It says each gives according to what they have and receives according to what they need. The problem in our reality is nobody makes any money. And we've been raised that I have the right to make my money. That's the nature of our society and the foundation of it. That's the reason that Africans were brought here to slave in the first place, was because we can make some money. And what we use is this tool of racism to keep them in check, to keep them on the plantation, to keep them on the job. And then we create laws to put them in jail to keep them on the job. And we create private prisons. Here's the danger. In fact, the danger about private prisons is that once you create a private industry and the government is subsidizing it, now you've got to support it. How do you support a private industry of prisons? You've got to put people in there. And that means more of us going to jail. Even more so than now. Because if you create private prisons, the government does that, then you've got to subsidize, you've got to support that industry. This state has supported more industries than it's supported people. I mean, we bailed out, 10 years ago, we bailed out Northwest Airlines. And even though my wife used to work for Northwest Airlines, this is one of the worst places to work. They'd be shooting for that one. I see what they did to my wife. Yeah.
I have a question about that. If prison goes to private, or it has, but if it increases and goes to private industry, then with the percentages of African Americans in prison, couldn't that be viewed as an attempt for cultural genocide against us?
Oh, sure. In fact, it's not new, though, because the attempt had been made from the beginning. How come you don't speak Hausa, or you don't speak Wolof, or you don't speak Shona, or you don't speak Tree? Because it was taken from you and made illegal for you to speak it, and every time you tried to speak it, we slashed you upside your back until you stopped speaking it, even in private. Nobody else on the planet has that ever been done to. Even when the Jews were in captivity in Egypt and in Babylon and in Germany, they still had their culture and language intact. When you take away people's language, you take away the foundation of their culture. When you take away the foundation of their culture, you destroy their humanity. A couple of years ago, when the argument came up in the Oakland County Public Schools about Ebonics, you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you what that was all about. That was a continuation of keeping black people from speaking a language that was common to their cultural ethos. That for the past 369 years, they'd been struggling to develop because the original cultures were taken. You can't call yourself a people in the context of humanity without a common language. Let me ask you this. Do you know where your forebears are from?
On my other side,
Where?
Czechoslovakia.
Czechoslovakia. How about you, Tracy?
Oh, German, Norwegian, English.
See, even if you weren't American, whatever that means, you could say German or Czechoslovakia, and there's a language and a land and a history of people that's older than 300 years old. African American people can't do that. The only group of people on the planet that can't do that. It's one of the reasons why I became a Pan-Africanist. I embraced the ideology of Pan-Africanism because I recognized the only way for me to connect with something that connects me with the history of human beings is to connect somehow with what's happened to African people who've been dispersed by the forces that created colonialism on the continent, slavery and racism outside. And the reality of that is that when you look at how those things happen, it's no wonder people are responding the way they do. Why do you think Czechoslovakia is not too far? All the things that were going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina, why did that happen? Because you took people who were living here for years and generations and moved them over here and said these people got to live where they were living who hadn't lived there before. That made me mad. This is my great-great-grandfather's neighborhood and his house, and now I can't live in it no more. That's what happened there. So that's what happened in Israel. You took all the Jews who had been beaten up in Europe for 1,500 years and moved them where the Palestinians had been living for at least 3,000. That's why that problem exists. The same thing in Rwanda. Because you move people, tell them to live over here, who didn't live over here, and move some other people where they used to live. And to be honest, the United States government is at the forefront of all of that. And again, all you have to do is read. It's there. Not just in the history books. If you've ever studied for a research paper, one of the things you look at is newspapers, periodicals, publications that come from all over the world. If you're really serious about studying, you really want to know, all that information is there. A lot of it's on microfiche. I still look up microfiche. Now they got everything on disk and you can pull it up on the internet. But there's still a lot of stuff there on microfiche. Information that has the understandings of the things that you're trying to figure out. Why every other day we're hearing about something going on in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv? What's it all about? More importantly, first of all, you have to be conscious enough to ask yourself the question that Martin Luther King and Bob Marley said. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Mm-hmm. If you let it in over here, sooner or later it's coming to your house. And you have to understand that the history of human beings acts like that. And so if you don't call it out, when it comes to you, you're going to be crying all by yourself and no one to back you. Because it's coming to your house.
I just want to know, we've been, so far in the conference, we've addressed a lot of the issues and problems. And as college students, as high school students, what do we've said we need to read, we need to educate ourselves. But there beyond, where do we go? What do we do? How do we know in doing what we're doing as college students and working and trying to get yourself together, what do I do in my position now? How do I try to make some type of a change if it's on me and my generation? How do I begin to do that?
As you continue to study sharing that. When I first came to this conference, how old are you, brother?
17.
I was 17 when I first came to this conference. I was a senior at Central, St. Paul Central. You from Central? Solid. So when I first came to this conference, since 1980, I've missed one conference. I've been here ever since. Because I was getting information that I wasn't getting anywhere else. During that period of time, I went through a lot of things where there were times when, as a student, I presented papers. I remember presenting a paper here on Kwame Ture and Kwame Nkrumah. And that was exciting as a junior in high school, junior in college to present a paper, and people are looking at me. And I was challenged when I wrote that to have read at least 3 books. There used to be a guy, I think his name was Professor X from NWA. You all remember NWA?
Mm-hmm.
That was Public Enemy.
Public Enemy, sorry. Sorry. Y'all know what I'm talking about. He was dismissed from the group for public relations reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was making some statements that were hard for people to take. And Chuck D said this about it. He says, most of the people complaining haven't read a book about the subject he's talking about.
Right.
He's read 25
Right.
about the things he was talking about. And so, in other words, you have to be prepared to back up what you say. So you go out and study, you do your research, and you don't stop. To this day, I continue to read stuff. Like last year, this time, I had a class on the civil rights immersion. We were at the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, and I saw his book sitting there in the bookstore there. And I had just read an article about it. In fact, he was going there a couple of weeks after we left there to do a book signing. And I picked up his book, and I read it by the time we got to Chicago.
Who?
And I was like, man, this... And he says from the beginning, I'm not saying how it's going to be paid, but his statement was clear. It's owed. It's crystal clear. That's a book you should have as college students. I know a couple of people bought it and hadn't even signed it today. That you had a chance to meet somebody of that caliber who is probably among all citizens of the United States, if there is one who had more to do with the fight to end apartheid in South Africa, like Dr. Johnson spoke, it was Randall Robinson. There was one individual who had more to do with the dismantling of apartheid, who was a United States citizen. It was him. And him and Nelson Mandela are this close. So we're talking history. Participate in it. Whenever you get a chance to do something like this, come. You go to college next year, the year after. If you're in this state, or if you're come to the conference, or seek other conferences. There are a variety of conferences around the country that address issues of black student leadership, African American student leadership on campus, and issues that are concerned. And it's important to do that because you need to continue to feed yourself inspiration and information so that you can begin to be motivated to do something. What you asked, Sophia, is about how can we do something on campuses? Well, you can start by sharing this information with people who didn't go. Go back to your campus, go back to your school, write a paper. Talk to your classmates about it. Tell other people about this information. Whether they agree or not, challenge them to come correct with some facts, some data, some information, some details. then your being here is not in vain. In addition to that, be challenged to be a leader. And that doesn't mean being out front and being president. That means doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes most of the work in a student organization is done by those people who are behind the scenes, who don't get, the upfront credit. Because of my mouth, I've always been out front. But I've always recognized most of the time when I'm in a position to be out front, there's at least 5 people behind me making it happen. Those people not only should get their propers, but should be recognized that this thing couldn't happen if they didn't do that work. Well, not the last thing, because this is a continuum. The third thing the last thing I'm going to mention, but the third thing I'm going to say is that someone once said to me, I think it was Benjamin Hooks, who used to be the president of NAACP a few years back. He said, if it rules you, you have a right, a privilege, and a responsibility to challenge it. In other words, if it tells you what to do, you have a responsibility to challenge it. Let me give you an example. I was thinking about something I think maybe Shanita said. I once took a class at the University of Minnesota on the history of ancient Egypt. And I had already read 2 books on ancient Egypt. And at the time, those books were contemporary. In other words, they had been written in the past 5 years. So the research in those books was recent. Me and a friend who I first brought to this conference, his name was Eric Wilson. And when we got back on Monday, his name was Farouk Olajuwon. That's how this conference affected him. Changed his name. Me and him and I took this class, and we took this class and walked into class, and we looked at the syllabus, and the professor showed us the book. The book was published in 1945 on the history of ancient Egypt. And we gave him 2 books that were published. One was 1980, one was 1978. 2 books that had been recently published on the history of ancient Egypt. And so we sat there the first day or 2 in class, and for a couple of the first things that were coming out of his mouth that we challenged him. Say, well, according to Basil Davidson, it says here, according to Dr. Albert Churchward, it says this. And we showed him the books. And he was an older professor. But you have a right to challenge a professor or a teacher's information. In fact, you have a responsibility to. Now, you just can't walk in there and say that ain't true. But you would have had to have done some homework in order to challenge it. Okay, where's your data? Where's your information? Because then your challenge can be considered legitimate. Otherwise, you're just wearing the X hat. And like I remember some people did this 10 years ago when that movie came out. Y'all going to see Malcolm 10? Because they didn't understand what the X was. That sounds funny, don't it? But there were people at this conference in 1989. And the reason I say that is because the challenge is to talk what you know and to know what you're talking about. Because otherwise, people in authority will tear you to shreds. Or, worse, they'll ignore you. If you don't know what you're talking about, no matter what you have to say, it'll be discounted. And that's why it's important to read. The other aspect is, when I said to learn how to read, to learn how to read in between the lines. We'll probably talk about this tomorrow in the session, but one of the things that's so important, it's the number one thing I think young people should have and human beings should have is the ability to think critically. Mm-hmm. There's a scripture in the New Testament where the Bereans were preached to by Paul. And then they went back to the scriptures to make sure that Paul was telling the truth. In other words, they checked Paul out. And they were considered noble for doing so. They were considered intelligent for doing so. Don't just believe what I'm telling you. Don't just listen to these speakers, what they say. Go and get it for yourself. Because once you got it, can't no one take it away from you. And then your ability to transmit it, to share it, to give it, to serve with it to someone else becomes effective. At this conference, particularly over the past 10 years, because of my role here, it's been one of those things where people come and ask me questions about this and that. And the challenge I have is the only question that you should ask me is, where did you get that from? How do you know that? So that you can go get it for yourself. Because history can only be complete to protect and preserve the future if you understand it. Politicians play on the ignorance of the masses. Because the first thing that comes out their mouth, well, the American people this. You ever hear that? The American people want this. The American people aren't even a people. This is a divided country into many different demographic lines. And you have politicians and pundits and spin doctors who pretend to speak for everybody. This is what the American people want. And unless you learn to read in between those lines, you'll believe what they say. When I teach classes on studying the Bible, I just use this example, the Gospels. For those of you who are Christian, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Understanding the Bible is understanding their perspective of things. And that way, when you see them write what they wrote, you understand that they wrote from their perspective. Matthew, who was a Pharisee, who was Jewish. Mark, who was a Roman citizen. Luke, who was a medical doctor trained in Greek. And John, who was Hebrew and Jesus' closest friend. And they wrote from their perspectives. So when you read those texts, you need to understand where they're coming from. So when I read a sociologist from Berkeley who's writing about why African Americans aren't successful in school, I begin to understand, oh, he's a sociologist from Berkeley. That says some things about him, right off the bat. And you get to know a little bit about him. How did he grow up? I mean, I had to do this when Clarence Thomas was elected to the Supreme Court. I couldn't understand how a black man from rural Georgia, raised by his black grandmama, would all but deny his African American heritage. I couldn't understand that. You had to read between the lines. Something happened to him along the way. And unless you do that, you'll learn to accept what people say at face value. If it rules you, if it guides you, you have a right, a responsibility to challenge it. Learn how to read, and then learn how to read in between the lines. So that when you're looking at history, you understand it in its perspective of its context so that you can apply it to what's going on, and then things begin to make sense. That's all I'm going to say. It's time to go. We've taken up all the time. Unless anybody has any other thing to say.
Did you tell them where you were from?
Huh?
Did you tell them where you were from? What your name is?
I'm Brother Joe from Augsburg College. I'm the director of the Pan-Afrikan Center. If that makes any difference. I'm an assistant pastor at Progressive Baptist Church. If that makes any difference. I got a wife and a child. If that makes any difference. The only thing that makes any difference to me is that we're here together. That's the only thing that makes any difference. So I encourage you to continue to get this information that's being served up here.
Fellowship. It's a period and a time where we share. We share the good news, we share the bad news. It's like the Bible. I tell people many times, there are lots of good things in that Bible, but there are lots of bad things in that Bible too. Okay? So we're gonna share the good